forget it. So forgot to start recording. So just for you to know, we have been doing a couple of conversations throughout the year related with complex topic. So we are a community around business agility topic. So we have a very strong purpose, which is helping next generation of organizations. Helping creating the next generation of organizations. So everything we do is around people. Everything we do is around helping organizations understanding their complexity and bringing agility to business. And this is why you are here today, because you have a lot to share with our community. We have a YouTube channel, and a lot of people will see this video after this conversation. So I'm sure that this will be a wonderful conversation. You'll have a lot of news to share with our community. And so I'd like to start welcoming you and welcoming everybody that is listening to us right now. I'll just share a quick video about our community. So it will be a 3-minute video. It will be also nice for you to know a little bit more of who we are. And this video is also an invitation to everyone that is listening to us. So come and join our community. So we have a strong purpose. We have a lot of people connected to us, and everybody is invited to join us. So more than sharing who we are, we want to invite you, everybody, to join us. So let me share that, and then I'll turn it over to you. And you can start, introducing yourself and sharing your presentation and everything you are bringing to us today.
The Business Agility Institute Brazil is a community of people who want to help creating the next generation of organizations. That is our purpose. Here in Brazil, we started our activities holding meetups on business agility and other related topics. We were officially born as a community on May 5th, 2020, when we held our first kickoff meeting and shared with all the volunteers our dreams, our vision of future, and our idea about our internal organization in nucleus of work. The nucleus of work are teams that also have a purpose. Volunteers can get to know what each nucleus means on our intranet and can choose the nucleus they want to be part of. Now we are going to tell you a little bit about the possibility of relating to the Institute of Brazil. You can be a volunteer and act in the nucleus team we just shared with you. You can be a corporate member and have your company participating in our global and regional events, executive forums, access our content library, participating in our learning and communication incubators, and several other initiatives that we offer. You can be an individual member and count on several initiatives from our community to develop your career as a transformation agent. You can have your company being a sponsor of the Institute and having your brand on all our communication vehicles. Anyone can connect with our community in Brazil. You just need to feel a connection with our dream of helping organizations and people. Everything else we will discover and overcome together. Our community in Brazil is with open arms for you, wherever your interest is. To learn more about the Business Agility Institute in Brazil, visit our website.
So this is a little bit about who we are, Esther, and everybody that is listening to us. And as I have said, this is an invitation for you to join us. We'll share at the end of this conversation with Esther Derby a couple of links, so you will have direction and instructions on how to connect with us here in Brazil. Okay, so now I would like to turn it over to you there. So just you can introduce yourself and share with us a little bit about what you are going to share with us, and feel free to share any presentation or anything you'd like to share with our community today.
Okay, so are we set up as a webinar right now? Is it possible to, given the number I'm seeing, I wonder if it's possible to make everyone a panelist so we can be a little more participative.
Oh, sure, we can do that. Let me see.
So while you do that, I'll get started. So I started my professional career as a programmer, and I have worn a lot of different hats over the years. So I was a team lead, and I did testing because we all used to do our own testing. And I was a dev manager, and I was an internal consultant. And for the last 20 plus years, I've had my own company, and I have worked with companies across the world and in many, many different sectors and in many different sizes to help them achieve better results, to achieve better productivity, and to be more agile. So I'm thrilled to be here with you today. A lot of people don't know about me is that my parents actually used to live in Brazil, but it was before I was born. So I've only visited Brazil once. I didn't actually get to live there, but my brother actually learned to speak Portuguese before he learned to speak English. But unfortunately, he doesn't remember much of it. So I'm going to talk to you today about some thoughts about how we can increase business agility. And I'm going to share some slides. Am I authorized to do that? Okay. I will do that. So, oh, well, that's not where it's supposed to start. It's supposed to start back here. So, in my experience, most organizations are not designed to be agile. They are designed to be stable and to resist change. So I'm curious if you guys could put something in the chat window. What have you seen that you think gets in the way of companies having business agility? What have you observed that gets in the way? You could put that in the chat. Anybody have any observations about what gets in the way? Bureaucracy. Yep. Yep, for sure. For sure, bureaucracy gets in the way. One of the hallmarks of bureaucracy that I find when I visit organizations, if I ask someone on the team level why they're doing what they're doing, and the only answer they have is because this is what we were told to do, then I know it's bureaucracy. I know that the jobs have been just put into little pieces, everything's been chopped into little pieces and things get put back together at some point, but most people don't have a strong connection to their work. Politics also comes into play. I think that often happens when the purpose isn't clear, and so politics seep in, right? Where everyone's looking out for their own best interests rather than the purpose of the organization. And yes, status quo, people fall into a certain way of being, and it's hard to think about how to get out of that. And I'm sorry, I don't read Portuguese or speak Portuguese, so can somebody tell me what?
Yeah, I can translate that for you. So
Thank you.
people's resistance remains when they have the illusion that they can control.
Okay, yeah, so people often don't respond as quickly as we would like them to, and that often gets labeled resistance, or people feel like they want to have more control and they feel like it's being taken away from them. So for sure that shows up. Silos, another thing that gets in the way. So I think there are a couple of things we need to pay attention to when we talk about how can we create a more agile organization. We have to take a little detour into thinking about systems to do that. So in every system, there are events, and that's what generally takes up our attention, right? So when someone mentioned politics tend to be events, right? We notice that a person will act in a certain way, or a person will prioritize their own personal goals over the organization goals. But someone also mentioned silos, and those are structural. So those are the dynamics. So we tend to focus on events because we're often under pressure and because we can see them. But we very often don't look at the patterns, which are events repeat over time and have meaning. And the patterns are the result of the structures, right? So a structure, like a silo, like a functional silo, will tend to create certain patterns of lack of collaboration, or people in different parts of the company not understanding how other parts of the company work, even though they have to work together for their to achieve some overall goal, right? So the dynamics give rise to patterns, but what we tend to pay attention to is the events. So that's one thing we really have to look at, and we really have to shift the way we understand that in order to achieve greater agility. And I have lost my cursor. Here we go. So one thing that we have as a legacy, and this comes under the heading of structure, is separation of head and hands. So in early large organizations, they were often founded by people who had education, and they used as labor people who didn't have education. So if you think of the early factories, the early textile factories, the people there were hired out of workshops or out of the country to work on these machines, and they tended to the machines, but really the people who had the ideas were the people at the top of the organization. And this legacy has stayed with us for centuries. So there's some very famous work done by Frederick Taylor in the US several years ago, Scientific Management, where he literally talked about, there are the people who think and there are the people who work. So there's strong separation of head and hands. And we still have this legacy with us, even though in the companies that we work in today, particularly in knowledge work, particularly in software, creative work, advanced manufacturing, we have super smart and super educated people. So the idea of separating heads and hands makes no sense anymore. But we still have that legacy, and it shows up in the way knowledge is shared or not shared in organizations. So I have also noticed that in most organizations, once they get to be bigger than, say, 30 people, there tends to be a split in who knows about the context, meaning what market are we in, how do we make money, who are our customers, how are we positioned with our customers, how do we relate to our customers, and the day-to-day work of what it takes to get the day-to-day work done. And there tends to be a little overlap, which I call the diamond, where people understand both of those. But when there's this divergence, people have little choice but to wait to be told what to do, right? So if you think about a bureaucracy, and someone mentioned a bureaucracy at the beginning, when you don't know the purpose of your work, you really can't do much but wait to be told what to do. So I was talking to a CEO a while ago who was complaining he couldn't find people who showed any initiative anymore. He said, you know, when we were small, I could find all sorts of great people to work here. But now that we're bigger, I can't find good people anymore. And I don't think it had anything to do with the people. I think it had to do with the fact that the knowledge had bifurcated. And the context was still held by the people who had been there when they were small, but was no longer understood by the people who had joined later. And so they had no choice but to wait until to be told what to do. So if we want to get more flexible, if we want to have agility, we need to make the diamond bigger, because we're all in favor of big diamonds. It's not that everybody has to know how to do every single job, but people have to need to at least understand, why are we in business? What difference are we trying to make? How we make money. And the people at the top of the organization need to understand what it actually takes to get the work done and what the capacity of the organization is. So I very often meet people who don't truly have an understanding of what their company produces. I remember having a conversation with someone who had a fairly high middle management job in a financial services company. And she thought that what we did in my department, which was development, software development, was we made little stacks of diskettes. And I then took her on a tour of the building that covered 2 square blocks that's housed all the computers and all the servers, and explained to her what was actually involved in doing our work, because she didn't know. So on the other side of that, there were people who were programmers who didn't understand that, you know, the fact that it took 1,000 hours to program something was a minimal amount of impact, considering how much money a single trade could be, right? So when you have this bifurcation, the people on both sides of it can appear foolish to other people, which erodes trust, which makes everything slower. So you have the erosion of trust, and you have the fact that people have to wait to be told what to do. So we have to make the diamond bigger. That's a really important thing. Now, when I talk about to organizations about the underlying dynamics, the underlying patterns and the events, we have to remove our focus so much on the events, understand the patterns, and then look at the dynamics. Now, I talk about 3 domains in organizations: steering, enabling, enhancing, and making. And they roughly correspond to the dynamics, the patterns, and the events. So steering has to do with that top of the diamond, that the questions about who we are, what do we do, why are we, excuse me, why are we in business? All of those questions about why our company really exists. And that creates the overall purpose, and they also have responsibility for creating the structure, right? The structures that are going to drive patterns of behavior. So how is the company organized? What are our reward systems? What are our policies, and so forth? So who has any questions about that, the steering part of the organization? Anybody have a question about that?
I believe that what you were saying is that steering is directly related with individual purposes connected with the organization purpose, right? I mean, it's the very intrinsic reason,
Right.
About why people do what they do, right?
Right. It is the reason the company exists. So every
Yeah.
company, no matter how big or small they are, have these concerns, right? They have to be concerned with, why do we exist? What's the difference we want to make in the world? How are we going to be structured? Right. So you have another set of concerns, and this is related to the enabling and enhancing, is what's needed to accomplish our why. And once we figure out how to do it, how can we do it even better? So the first domain, steering, is about why are we? And the second domain, enabling and enhancing, is how do we accomplish our purpose? And how can we continually improve at creating our purpose? And the third domain, which I call making, is about how do we actually create and deliver our products and services. Now, these exist in every company. Some companies I have encountered, everybody is involved in every one of these domains. Everyone is involved in deciding, where are we going? How are we going to be structured? Where are we going to focus? What's our product? But that's pretty unusual. Very often these follow roughly hierarchy. They roughly follow hierarchy. So steering, enabling, and enhancing are domains. They are not levels, even though they very often track to hierarchical levels. Like the senior managers are most engaged in steering, middle managers are most engaged in enabling and enhancing, and the people on teams are most engaged in making. They aren't solid lines. Like in most organizations, we have these very, very strict job descriptions, and they outline what people are supposed to do and what your responsibilities are. These are not quite like that. They can be a little more fluid, and I have met people that have responsibilities both at the steering domain and enabling and enhancing, or making and enabling and enhancing. So it really focuses on what are the concerns and what is the work that needs to be done, rather than a hierarchical situation where everyone has their little job description and is supposed to follow their job description, which actually, in my experience, results in a lot of work falling through the cracks. So these exist without regard to hierarchy. They often map that way, but they don't require hierarchy, and they don't require dismantling hierarchy. So every once in a while, I run into people who say, we don't need managers. We need a completely flat organization. That works sometimes, but even if you have a completely flat organization, you still have these concerns, right? You still have to pay attention to these concerns. And even if you have a hierarchy that's 12 levels deep, you have to pay attention to these concerns. However, I find that framing these concerns as these domains gets people off the focus that bureaucracies often have, which is everything is decomposed to the point where it often loses meaning. Does that make sense to folks?
Yeah, Esther, I actually have a question related
Okay.
with the real world, right? And the question is, I think it completely makes sense to me, everything that you were sharing with us, but how in real life can we help organizations with that? Because what we see is that every organization is born with a strong purpose, right? And as long as they grow, and new people join the organization, new executives, and the board is being formed with new people, they get disconnected, right? They focus on the results directly, and they disconnected from the original purpose. So I have been working in an organization where this was very true. And I had the opportunity to discuss that with the CEO. It made a lot of sense to him. So he agreed it with me. So we are lost. So we disconnected from our purpose. And he was willing to help the organization rescreen this purpose. To all the committee, the board members, and to make the purpose alive again. This is not easy, right? Because even the CEO being the main sponsor of this purpose rescuing, this was not easy. So my question to you is, how helping organizations in real life bringing their purpose to life?
Well, I think you have to talk about it, right? I think people often assume because they understand it that everyone else understands it. So I think it has to be talked about frequently. And I think it has to be connected to the day-to-day work people are doing. Like, how does my work fit into the big picture? Because when people don't understand that, it's very easy to become disconnected. It's very easy to just, kind of do your things by rote without understanding how they fit. There's an interesting story I read. It relates to job descriptions too, which is, people think about the people who clean hospital rooms as being fairly low level employees without a great understanding of what the purpose is. They know it's a hospital, but they're there to clean. But most people in that role actually do understand very deeply that their purpose is the care of patients, and they make all sorts of decisions that don't show up in their job descriptions to carry out that purpose. So they understand purpose, right? So you have to talk about it, and you have to help people understand how their work fits in. Now, if the work has been so disconnected from the customer or so atomized that it's, you're just doing one task, you're just giving approvals for people to have access to certain screens in the computer system. If that's all you do all day, then it's hard to feel any sense of purpose. So talk about it, but then make sure that the way the jobs are set up, it connects to purpose. Because we have a long legacy of decomposing work to the point where it may seem very efficient, but it is very disconnected from purpose. So think about how the work's designed, which is a structure, which is going to drive patterns of behavior.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I think this is a useful thing to consider when you're thinking about business agility, which is that in any functional hierarchy, you have to balance enough central control so that people know what the purpose is, and you can achieve coordination with autonomy so that people feel some sense of control and people feel some sense that they are not just cogs in a machine, right? Now, we tend in organizations or in our, I think this is just a human tendency, we tend to either go one way or to the opposite pole. So we think that, you know, you either have control or you have chaos. And that's actually not the case. You can actually work with that polarity and create a system that gives you that central control, but also allows people to have autonomy and creativity and to step into responsibility, which allows agility. So to do that, you need to attend to clarity, conditions, and constraints. Now, these are fractal. They exist on every level, every domain. They exist in the steering domain, the enabling and enhancing domain, and in the making domain. And they have to do with the ways that we are able to influence patterns. So we need the structures that support creativity and support people understanding the purpose. And these are the things that help us shape patterns in addition within that. So people know what to work on and they know how their work fits into the big picture. People have the means to do their work. This has to do with conditions. It's extraordinarily frustrating for people to be told that they are supposed to be doing a certain job or a certain task, but they don't have the equipment or the means to do it. I think many of us experienced that when we first went into lockdown in the US, where, you know, people were supposed to work from home, but they didn't necessarily have the equipment that would enable that, or their Wi-Fi wasn't good enough, or, you know, they're working at the kitchen table, so they didn't have the conditions to do that. But even in normal circumstances, I often find that teams are lacking training, they're lacking access to outside expertise, they may not have reasonable equipment to do their work. So that's kind of a prerequisite, right? And then the organizational structures and policies have to support that. So one thing I see very, very frequently in organizations is that managers will ask for collaboration, but yet all the reward structures and policies are emphasizing individual achievement. People are recognized and rewarded and promoted for individual achievement in a way that drives competition, right? So the conditions have to do with actually enabling people to do the work and then having the structures and policies that support that. So the dynamics support the pattern that you want to achieve. So, as I said a few minutes ago, people often freak out about the idea that if we don't have control, we're going to have chaos. And that's where constraints come in. Now, in certain disciplines, constraints have a negative connotation. They're viewed as a constriction to flow. I'm talking about constraints that dampen flailing. So constraints that help people understand this is how we're always going to treat our customer. This is what we would never do with a customer. This is how we're always going to treat our coworkers. We would never treat a coworker in this way. So constraints that set boundaries about appropriate behavior. It may have to do with fiscal responsibility. It may have to do with you know, various ways we interact with the outside world. But it also has to do with decisions. So people need to know what their decision boundaries are. Now, if you have made the diamond bigger, so people actually understand the context, then it becomes much easier to create bounded autonomy for people. So let me tell you a little story that may illustrate what I mean by bounded autonomy. My neighbors have who moved in a few years ago have a couple of dogs, and they were going to put in one of those underground electric fences called an invisible fence, but they weren't quite ready to do it because they were going to put up a garage. So they just left that electric wire on the ground. Do you guys have that in Brazil? Do you have that invisible fence in Brazil? No, not a thing there.
I don't think so, yeah.
Yeah, well, they're illegal in some countries. But at any rate, that's what my neighbors had. And they had the wire just draped on the ground. And the dogs wore a special collar so that when they crossed the wire, they would literally get an electrical shock. And every time the wind blew, the wire would move. And it could move up to 6 feet. So those dogs never knew where the boundary was. And pretty soon they were afraid to get off the porch. So this is what happens in organizations. Not that people are dogs, but that when people don't know what the articulated boundary is, and they accidentally cross it and get slapped, then they stop taking risks. And this leads to a really rigid organization because people always wait to be told or have to ask permission. So this bounded autonomy piece is super important. It's super important that people know, within this boundary, you can make decisions. Within this constraint, you can make decisions. You can spend up to $10,000 on training. It needs to be related to the work we're doing, whatever it is. But within that, they can make decisions. This makes organizations much faster, right? It makes them much faster because people don't have to wait. They don't have to wait. It also builds trust and it builds skill, right? So these, as I said, are fractal. They live on every level, and they play out sort of like this, right? So it's the clarity is about who we are, what our value proposition is. The conditions have to do with the macro level organization and key policies, and the constraints have to do with guiding principles about how we run our business and how we want to be, and sanctioned variation. What variation is allowed. And that's another thing that really gets in the way of business agility is we are sort of in love with standardization and the idea of efficiency. Standardization is only efficient when the work is standard. When the work isn't standard, it's far from efficient, and it really gets in the way. So I think people have to think about what is the sanctioned variation. Here's our North Star. Here's what we would never do. Here's what we would always do. In there, you can have variation. They play out in enabling, enhancing in adaptive planning and knowing what the priorities were and making trade-offs and making the goals compelling, making sure people know what work is coming in the queue. And problem finding, which has to do with enhancing the system, right? Figuring out where the obstacles are and figuring out how to smooth those out for the organization. So there's a question, what's the biggest challenge related to enabling constraints? I think people aren't used to thinking about constraints. And people think about constraints as constrictions, whereas you chose a really interesting word there because constraints can be enabling. So I sometimes see teams that are in huge conflict, whether they're management teams or whether they're development teams that are in huge conflict because they have too many choices. So that in that case, a constraint says, it can make things much easier. It can make things more clear. But in terms of helping people work with them, I think they're just unfamiliar. Although in our day-to-day life, we know a lot about constraints. In our day-to-day life, we use them pretty much every day. And if you've ever planned a party you know about constraints. Because there's the constraint of the size of the venue, there's the constraint of the budget, there's the constraint of what's the sort of theme of the party. You know, are you going to have an open bar, or are you going to have a closed bar where there's, you know, people get served 1 or 2 drinks, that's it. And that's constraint, right? You know, the guest list is a constraint. You know, if you make sure that you invite a certain group of people who are going to be compatible, right? And you don't invite your uncle who always gets in fights with people, right? That's a constraint. So we actually know a lot about constraints in real life. We aren't used to thinking about them in terms of how do we create the patterns in organizations. So another way that constraints show up on the enabling and enhancing domain is in facilitating those conversations about which decisions rest with management, which decisions rest with the team, which decisions do we share. So for example, hiring, I think, is very often should be a shared decision, right? The conditions have to do with making sure that teams have what they need, doing lateral linking, so making sure that silos are talking to each other, how work flows into the team, so that teams don't have, you know, a glut of work that they can't possibly accommodate, and then working on those cross-cutting issues that influence many parts of the organization. And of course, they exist on the team level too, on the making level, where they can do also local adaptive planning. They make local priority decisions. They find problems that are local to them. They create the micro conditions for the team. And they think about what their working agreements are, how they're going to approach, and how they're going to interact with each other. So clarity, conditions, and constraints exist in slightly different forms on the 3 different domains, but they are all about creating pattern. They're about creating that pattern. Any other questions at this point?
I have a question, Esther.
Okay.
All right. So my question is related with autonomy, right? You have mentioned about people's autonomy and the boundaries and how to make it clear what the boundaries are, so they can allow it to have autonomy and not cross those boundaries and etc. So my question is related with the effort required to have people aligned. You know what I mean? So I think autonomy is something that is much better when the level of alignment is very high in the organization. So people have autonomy, but they know, everybody know on everybody where everybody is going. So if there is no alignment, if the level of alignment is low, autonomy can be a problem. So so how do you see that? So how people, considering that most leaders say that they have no time, you know, to spend with people, to allow them to increase the level of alignment. So how do you see that challenge within organization? How do you see the level of alignment can be increased to enable autonomy?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I want to make one clarification, because I may not have said this real clearly. The boundaries, unlike the dogs next door who get a shock when they hit the boundary, in organizations, the boundary is really a signal for a conversation, right? So if we're in this boundary, we can make these decisions. But if we bump up against the boundary, then we need to have a conversation. We don't get a shock. We just need to have a conversation, because sometimes, you know, there's something that's $10 over the boundary that is vastly superior to what is within the boundary, and then you have a conversation and talk about the trade-offs, and you move ahead. To your main point, I agree that you have to have alignment, which I would call clarity, in order to have autonomy that is coordinated and working towards a common purpose, right? So when I meet executives who, or managers, I hear this from managers up and down the line who feel like they don't have time to do this. What I usually do is I sit down and say, well, what would you have, what things do you not have time for now that you would have time for if you weren't dealing with all of these, permissions and fires and other people could take care of some of that stuff. And they almost always come up with a really important list of things that they could be attending to. It does take some lead time to create these conditions, to get to the point where people understand, the context. Why are we in business? What's our purpose? Who is our customer? What difference are we making in their life? But the payoff is huge, right? So I try to help people see the benefits of the investment versus just, I'm so busy. It's like, well, one of the ways to get unbusy is to make it possible for some other people in the organization to do some of the stuff that you're taking on now, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it could release a lot of time if we could have people, with more autonomy. But I think the challenge is how cross the bridge, right? Because sometimes people are on fire, resolving a lot of day-to-day problems, and they do not see the light on how to do that. How can I have, arrange some time to talk when I am under pressure for a lot of things around me, pressure for results and et cetera, and et cetera. So I understand what you say. I think the challenge is how they can see a way of crossing the bridge, right? Because after crossing the bridge, and after people have their autonomy, they will be much better. But how crossing the bridge is the challenge.
Well, I think you start with the easiest place you can and the smallest place you can, and then you make it. You continue to build on that. I mean, I think that's one of the fallacies we have about organizational change, is that it will just happen, right? And everything will be different all at once. And that generally, unless it's a system collapse, doesn't happen. I mean, it's a confluence of many factors that bring about a change in most complex systems. Now, what we often do in organizations is we think about the vision we have, right? And we try to overlay something on that to create our vision, but we don't think about what are the conditions now and what's holding the pattern in place and what is the smallest thing we can do to change that. So it's an iterative thing, right? You don't get to it all at once. So sometimes what I do is I just gather some data about, what's the thing that's taking up most of your time, or what are the 5 things that are taking up a lot of your time, and let's just take one of those and see what we can do with that. What can we do with that one thing? I mean, when I was a dev manager, and when I was a programmer, we shared on-call responsibilities, and I didn't particularly like being called in the middle of the night, so I started collecting data, and I just put up a picture of our job stream, and I put a push pin in when something would blow up in the middle of the night. And pretty soon we had some data, and then we could work on, we didn't call it refactoring then, but improving those programs so that they would be less prone to blow up, right? So you get some data, and then you begin to work on it doesn't have to be the biggest thing. It can be the easiest thing, right? And you make a little improvement there, and then you get yourself some breathing room, and then you can do the next thing. So there's another question in the chat that I'm trying to read. Oh, yeah. I often see the sea level as far from reality and far from what happens in the trenches too. Yeah. Well, just like that, I showed you the two diamonds earlier, just like it helps for the people doing the day-to-day work to understand the context. It helps for the executives to understand what actually goes into the work, right? They understand the capacity of the organization. So, it's like that executive who thought I was sitting around making diskettes all day. She had no idea what I did. So I tried to help her understand it. I didn't teach her how to program, but I tried to help her understand the complexities. So I think going to visit and having some respect for that work is helpful. There's another part to this. Many training proposals have far from the reality. What do you think about that? And the second question, how can you know what chosen processes and projects will allow us to fulfill our mission? Yes, training is often unrealistic because it assumes everything can be taught in a couple of days, when it often takes a great deal of continual learning to gain mastery over something. And they often address behavior rather than thinking. And I think we would do well to pay more attention to how people think about their jobs than just, how to carry out particular practices or techniques. How can we know that chosen processes and projects will allow us to fulfill our mission? I think we rely too much on big design up front, and I think we would be better off trying something small and then iterating and seeing how it goes and learning as we go, right? There's just so many things where people choose a process and they just slap it on top of what exists, and it doesn't actually solve the problem. So I think it's better to start small, experiment, and learn as you go, and then you have a chance to steer. So someone said, I recently read the Netflix books, and how can we not fall into the trap of thinking about rules but restrictions? I haven't read the Netflix books, so I don't know exactly what, I don't have the context there. But I think the key is, a boundary is something you bump up against and then you have a conversation. Right, and the constraints are what we always do and what we never do, more so than this is a rule you have to follow. I mean, because it's rules. There are some rules where we have to have it about the way finances are handled and the way certain legal things are handled. But I think it takes more conversation around what are the examples. Let's talk about the examples. And those, I think, relate more to restrictions in that sense, not having read the book. So I just want to end with a couple of thoughts here. The original purpose of hierarchy is always to help the originating subsystems do their job better. And somehow we lose sight of that in many organizations, particularly as they become bureaucracies, right? The hierarchy becomes a thing of its own, that the purpose is to get more privilege and have more people report to you and have a bigger budget. But the original purpose of hierarchy is always to help the subsystem work better. And I think if we can hold on to that idea of hierarchy and think about work to be done in terms of steering the organization, enabling, enhancing the ability to meet the mission, and supporting the people who are actually doing the work, I think we will end up with much more flexible and much more agile organizations. So I think we have a couple more minutes for questions if you have them.
Yeah, we do have a couple of more minutes. I actually would like to thank you so much for you know, all the sharings, all the insights, and everything you are bringing to us here today. I don't know if anyone else have a last question to Esther. No, I don't think so, Esther. So thank you so much. I'm sharing with you in the chat a couple of links where you can connect with our community here in Brazil. You can respond to the survey about the experience with Esther today and everything that she has shared with us. And I hope we can get connected again, Esther. We are planning a very, huge conference, the first BAI conference in Brazil in 2021. So we will have all our corporate members, our individual members, and a lot of guests with us. I hope you can be with us in that moment. So thank you so much. Once again, I hope we can get connecting going forward. And I think that's it for today. If you want to leave a final message to our community, that's something that is important, in your opinion, for people to keep in mind when working with organizations, working with people, something that, in your opinion, cannot be missed. So just leave a final message and we can close the conversation.
Iterate. Iterate, iterate, iterate. Change to agile in an agile manner.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good advice. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.